Thanks, Louise. Hi, everybody. I'm Emma Clack from Heneom HR, and this training workshop is all around getting your HR ducks in a row. So today we're going to be talking about the essential people processes for small and medium-sized businesses if they are looking to employ somebody, maybe for the first time, or maybe they've already employed people and they want to know what they need to have in terms of their HR processes in place. Or it might be that you've already got a team that's growing and you just want to check that you are compliant. So we will be running through some slides today that hopefully cover off all the main points, and I will share with you my contact details at the end, how you can get in touch. So an introduction to myself, I'm Emma Clack. I'm an HR partner for small to medium-sized businesses, mainly in Hertfordshire and all different industries. I've been in HR for over 15 years now, but I've been an independent HR partner for 4.5 years, running my own HR and recruitment business. But today we're going to focus on the HR side of things. I'm a true generalist, which means that I cover off all aspects of HR. I have my favourite parts of the HR wheel, so to speak, but I can cover off any aspect of human resources that my clients need me to do. And I have a range of clients. I've got clients in hospitality, manufacturing, IT, all sorts of services, healthcare, and I do really enjoy working for not-for-profits and charities as well. So what we're going to cover off today is what HR processes and policies do you need? What is the legal requirement and what are myths? Because there are quite a few myths out there around the processes and policies that you have to have. And we're also going to talk about the employment landscape here in 2026 because it has changed quite a bit in the last few years. There's been a major overhaul of employment law, possibly the biggest in the last 10 to 15 years, certainly since I've been working in the HR landscape. And there's a lot of changes that have come through that impact every single business, whether you've got one employee or 1,000, these changes impact everybody. And then we'll finish off with where you can find more information and support and a Q&A session if anyone has any questions at the end. So to start off with, we've got a section on contracts of employment and policies, and I call this the written essentials. So what pieces of paper, although they won't be paper anymore, hopefully you're storing everything in the cloud, what contracts of employment do you need and what policies do you need to stay legal and compliant? So the written essentials are everybody who's employed by you should have a contract of employment. And I also encourage my clients to not only have contracts for their employees, but for anybody that does any service with them. So whether it's a service agreement for a contractor, or if you've got a worker who's not classed as an employee, but as a worker, maybe a seasonal worker, you should always have a written statement or a written contract in place just to cover off the terms and conditions by which you have agreed that they will work for you and the terms and conditions of pay. Now, that can be an actual contract, like a traditional contract that we all could picture with terms and conditions written at the top and then a list of terms and conditions, or it could be an email. So perhaps you've offered somebody a job and you've sent them an email and it's got a list of all of the terms on there. That would constitute a contract. It might be a very detailed offer letter. That would still go down as the contract because that's what you have agreed. So if you have written somebody an offer letter or an email and they've responded to say, yes, thank you, that's great, I'll start with you next Monday, that really is a binding agreement. So when we talk about contract, it's not necessarily that formal piece of paper or Word document. And then in terms of policies, there really only are 3 policies that are legally required. And that is the equality, diversity and inclusion policy. That's a disciplinary and appeals policy and also a grievance and complaints policy. And the law says that you must have those 3 in place. And that's all about having a fair process. It's all about treating people fairly. It's about making sure that you are doing what you say you're going to do in the workplace. So disciplinary and appeals, for example, it's about managing people through a disciplinary process and making sure that you follow what you say you're going to do. Now, these policies, they're readily available from ACAS. So ACAS is a fantastic resource, which I'll share the details with later on in the workshop. But for example, you could get these policies from ACAS and you just have to follow the statutory guidelines. You don't have to come up with anything new. You don't need to rewrite the wheel. Just use the standard statutory processes and you will be covered legally. And they're very good. They're very good policies. You don't have to put in a lot of time and effort. if you don't want to. Other policies that I would highly recommend are health and safety. So if you have over 5 employees, then you do have to have a health and safety policy in place. I would highly recommend it for any business. I don't understand why you'd have health and safety for 5 people, but not for 4. So have one in place. And again, there are resources where you can find a policy and a risk assessment to go with that policy, for example, on the HSE website. I also recommend to my clients that they have an equal opportunities policy, a preventing sexual harassment in the workplace policy. And I include that one because that is the focus at the moment for the changes in the government legislation, which we'll talk about in a minute. I also encourage absence management, performance management, data protection, because if you're employing people, you are holding their data, and also a time away from work policy, which would include maternity leave, paternity leave, bereavement leave. So that's really what I would call the written essentials. All of these documents, that they shouldn't be long. They should be written in a language that reflects your organisation. I wouldn't write them in really traditional legal language. I would write them really simply. You know, if you are sick and you can't come to work, this is what we would like you to do, and then just list what you would like your employers to do. It doesn't have to be worded in a way that's really complicated, and you don't have to have complicated processes in place. And then the contracts of employment, when you're thinking about employing somebody, or if you've just employed somebody, and you're thinking about what type of contract to give somebody, or if you want to offer somebody a job, you're not really sure, have a think about how flexible you need to be. Are you growing your business? What do you need to take into consideration? For example, do you want to put everybody on a permanent contract? So if you are pretty certain that in the next 2 to 5 years you're going to have cash flow and you can afford staff for that period of time, then a permanent contract is absolutely fine. If your business is quite seasonal, or you're quite new and you're not quite sure about your cash flow or your funding or where your money's coming from, then I would urge you not to go on a permanent contract. Perhaps think about a fixed term contract. Perhaps think about something more along the lines of a 0 hours contract, or a temporary contract. So don't just assume that everybody needs a permanent contract. You can also be quite flexible with hours. You could be flexible with seasonal working. So, for example, you can have contracts that say during the school holidays, these are your hours, and then during the non-school holidays, these are your hours. And it does add a level of complexity when it comes to payroll, when it comes to holiday management. But actually, if that works for your business, then the best thing to do is put that into the contract. And also, if you're forecasting to grow your business, think about what you might need in the years to come. So, for example, you might need a couple of people on a permanent contract, but then you might want to recruit some people on a more fixed term basis if you're intending on growing, but you're not really sure about what that period of growth will look like. There's a lot of noise out there at the moment around 0 hours contracts, and that's because the government, when Keir Starmer came into power, he did announce in the Employment Rights Bill that he would scrap 0 hours contracts. And then the communication changed, and it wasn't that they would scrap 0 hours completely, it was that they would scrap exploitative 0 hours contracts. And what they mean by that is they will remove 0 hours for businesses that are using them in the wrong way. And these will be businesses that just put people on 0 hours, and then they do exploit them by only offering them hours that suit the business, and potentially not treating those employees fairly. However, there's a huge proportion of UK businesses that use 0 hours in the right way, and they won't be removing them for those. So, for example, hospitality and seasonal workers, you have to have 0 hours. I think the hospitality industry would collapse over Christmas, for example, if we didn't have 0 hours that we could use. And for some employees, 0 hours really works. So don't make the assumption that 0 hours is a negative thing. There are plenty of employees who love a 0 hours contract because, for example, they might want to work for a couple of months and then they might want to go away, go and work somewhere else, go on holiday, travel. They might want the summer off. There are many reasons why people really like 0 hours. And then in your contracts of employment, there are certain things that you absolutely have to include. And then there are clauses that it's really up to you what you want to include. So you must include up-to-date information that's in line with all of the employment acts that are in play. So I've listed them here. Um, and I would help you with those, just making sure that you've got them all there. And it's normally just a statement at the top that says all of the information in this contract is in line with all of these acts. You absolutely have to state that your contract is based in the UK as well and that you're governed by UK law. If you've got employees that are working abroad, but they are contracted to your business, which is registered in the UK, then that's fine. But if you've got employees who are working for an international business, you would have to have a contract that is legally binding in that country. And within your contract, you need to include things like hours, pay, location, frequency of pay. I would highly recommend including probationary period, and you must include pension and notice period as well. And then you might want to think about adding other clauses, such as a confidentiality clause, if you're going to be sharing business information or client information that you don't want shared. You might want to include something about conflicts of interest or about company property. I'd highly recommend data protection clauses. And also, there's lots of different variations that you can include, and it really does depend on your business. One clause that people often ask me to put in is a non-competitive and a poaching clause to make sure that people aren't moving around from one competitor to another or poaching, leaving and then poaching people from the business they've just left. And there's a myth out there that once you've sent someone a contract, then you can't change that contract. But you can vary a contract with notice and consultation. So, for example, if I have somebody who has a contract with a 4-week notice period and I want to vary their terms and conditions and update some of the clauses and make changes, I would give them notice. So I would say, I'd go into consultation with them and I would say, look, these are the reasons why I'm changing the terms and conditions. Your notice period is 4 weeks, so let's have a 4-week consultation period and we'll talk about the changes. We'll talk about what we want to do differently, the reasons why. It's really important you talk about the business reasons why. And then at the end of that notice period, at the end of that 4 weeks, you can issue them with a new contract. They might not agree with the changes, and then unfortunately, that would be the end of their employment if you go through with those changes. Okay. Now, this section on policies is really a guide to how we do things around here. That's how I like to think of policies. So we talked about the 3 policies that you absolutely have to have in line with the ACAS guidelines. And then all the other policies that you have really are about the culture of your organisation, the rules. You know, how do we work around here? What do we accept? What do we not accept? And in general, we take the ACAS guidelines and we take employment law and then we match that to your organisation. So we match it to your culture, we match it to the number of people. So, for example, a policy for a sickness absence policy for an organisation with 5 people will be very different to a policy for 500 people because you have to keep on top of things, and it's very difficult to keep on top of 500 employees, but not so much with 5. But it is really linked to culture. And one of the first things that I say to people when they ask me to write them a policy or update a policy, one of the first things is I book in a call or a visit to get an understanding of the business owner, and how they run their business. Your policies should be meaningful. So don't just regurgitate what you find on the internet. You can obviously take stuff from the internet, but then put it into human language that fits your business. Don't refer to things that don't exist in your business because they won't hold weight. And also, I see this often, people just leave blanks where they're supposed to fill in the information. So they might have downloaded something off the internet and then they leave a blank instead of filling out the information. And that can lead to legal problems, especially with things like health and safety. So if you've downloaded a health and safety policy and a health and safety risk assessment, but you haven't actually filled it out or you haven't changed it to suit your business and to match what your business is doing. And if you had a health and safety problem and were taken to court, your policy and your risk assessment wouldn't stand up because the tribunal or the court would say, well, what you've done here is just downloaded a document. It's not a living, breathing policy that you're using. I also try and make sure that people aren't telling people off in their policies. We don't want to, it's not sort of, you must do this, you must do that. It's really nice to write a policy in an educating way that supports people. I always try and use the first person. I refer to you, we, not the company says, or it is mandatory that you do this. It's a lot nicer for employees and it's a lot more welcoming, especially for a new starter. If you think about giving somebody a handbook at the start of their journey with you, it's a lot nicer if those policies reflect how you talk to people, and it makes them feel included, not told off from day one. If you happen to have no policies in place, then the statutory ACAS guidelines would apply. So, for example, if you've got employees now and you didn't have a disciplinary and appeals policy in place, the ACAS guidelines would automatically apply to your business. And remember that you can update policies at any time. So with the contract, if you want to update a contract of employment, you have to go into consultation and give people notice. With policies and procedures, you don't have to. So, for example, if you have a holiday policy that only gives people the statutory amount of 20 days, and you wanted to update that because you thought, actually, this year I want to give my employees more holiday, or I want to give them the option of buying some holiday, then you can update that policy at any time. All I would say, or all I would advise, is that if you're making reasonable changes, then that's fine. Make those changes, tell your team, and then you're okay. If you're making changes that will impact pay or time off, or you think will cause a bit of a stir and a rumble, then I would advise you to update the policy, but then go into some sort of consultation that says to people, look, this is what I want to do. Let's have a chat about how you feel about it or how it's going to impact. And then perhaps you could get some feedback from your teams as to whether that policy is going to stick. Because what you don't want to do is introduce a policy that then causes you more problems and more work. And eventually you might end up going back on yourself and saying, oh, actually, I shouldn't have done that. That takes up far too much time, and people will lose trust in you and the process. So a very quick case study around how policies can vary between businesses. So for example, on the left-hand side here, we've got a sick pay policy, sick pay and leave policy for one organisation, and then on the right-hand side for a different organisation. And you can see how it's different. So the organisation on the left, let's say that they're a very small business, they don't have much cash flow, they've stuck to the statutory sick pay of being paid from day one. There's no company sick pay, there's nothing extra here, it's just the statutory rights. So their sick pay policy would pretty much follow the ACAS guidelines, and then there's no sort of extra that the business can put in there. And it might not be that the business doesn't want to do it, it might be that right now at this point in time the business can't afford it. So they have decided not to expand on the basic policy around sick pay. And then on the flip side there, you've got the other organisation where they can afford to pay company sick pay from day one instead of SSP. SSP is not a lot of money, it's only £116 a week for a full-timer. So they can afford company sick pay, they can afford a lot of company sick pay, so 20 days. And then after 20 days, perhaps they can afford to pay somebody half pay for a period of time, and then SSP. And then perhaps they can also afford some occupational health support as well. So their policy would be the ACAS basics, and it would be added to. So we would spend some time adding these extras, putting in the extra benefits. We'd do a cost balance. So we'd be able to work out, well, what does that actually look like? We'd look at how much sick pay they might have paid last year and the year before, and we put all of that in the mix and decide what would be a good sick pay and leave policy for that specific business. And what we want to do is make the policy reflect the organisation and the culture of the organisation. Some organisations really like to measure absence, so you can use something called the Bradford factor. You can measure all of your absences, you can give people a target. The big retailers, they work on an absence target of 3%. So if you have more than 3% of your contracted hours off work, sick, then they will call you into an investigation meeting. And for some businesses, putting in a process like that just doesn't work. It really turns off the employees, and it just doesn't reflect the culture of the organisation. So that's a kind of comparison of two different organisations and how we would put a policy together. Now, in terms of policies, there's been a huge amount of changes since COVID, since 2020. We seem to come back into the workplace after COVID with a lot of changes that were cultural. So around flexible working, around remote working, hybrid, there's a huge focus on well-being, and I think that's driven by Gen Z coming through. There's a big focus on menopause. We're going to talk in a minute about focus on bereavement policies. There's been a lot of changes around bereavement, and there's still more to come. And there's more support coming for parents, carers, and time off for independence. And I think a lot of that is a cultural shift when we came out of COVID and people actually questioned, what do we actually want from our workplace? What are we doing here? From an employee point of view, what do we want from our employers? And from the employer point of view, how can we support our teams more? And I think that's a generational shift um, where a lot of people are actually asking, not necessarily for a salary increase. I think traditionally, when people said, what benefits would you like at work? We assumed people would like more money. Actually, what Gen Z are asking for now is instead of giving me an extra bit of salary, could you pay for a gym membership for me? Could you pay for private medical insurance? Could I have a wellbeing day? And we're becoming a lot less generic with, oh, just here's a salary increase of 3%. We're actually having to think about what fits in with what people want. I would always recommend that if you're going to put policies together around benefits and around well-being, ask your teams first. What would they like to see? I don't think you should put policy together and assume. I think we should ask employees what would they like to see. You could do a simple survey, you could do some focus groups, or you could simply send out a questionnaire or an email that just says, look, we're reviewing our policies. We'd like to put a well-being policy in place. What does that mean to you? I've got a client who every lunchtime, everybody goes for a walk, and they insist that at lunchtime you turn off your screens, you leave your station, and you do something. So whether you walk or whether you sit and have lunch somewhere or whether you go out somewhere, they have a real tools down at lunchtime. And that works really well for that environment. And they've got to that place because they've consulted and they've asked employees what they would like. And then following on from policies and where do you put your policies is always a good question. So some people just have policies that they save on in the cloud, or they put them on the intranet if they've got an intranet at work, or they physically have a handbook. The employee handbook is a myth in itself. A lot of people say to me, well, I have to have an employee handbook. And you absolutely don't. It's not a legal requirement. And if you were to Google employee handbooks and look up the price of having an employee handbook, you can be charged a lot of money. So don't just assume you have to have one, and be a bit creative as well about your employee handbook. So traditionally they're in Word or PDF. I've seen handbooks that are on Trello boards, really inventive and creative. I've seen PowerPoint presentations as an employee handbook. I've seen booklets, and I've also seen videos where people have, instead of giving you a book to read with, pages and pages of hundreds of pages, it's people talking, and it's lots of different people within the organization talking about the different policies. And then you can back it up with the policies that are saved in the cloud or on the internet. So have a think about how an employee handbook would land in your organization. You don't have to have it. You could just have a set of policies, but it is nice to have a handbook. And a lot of business owners see it as something really, really great to give somebody when they start with a business, to explain a bit about the business, a bit about the organization, how we do things around here. It's an introduction to the company. You might have a bit about the people that work there. And it's a really good place to store information. But don't just assume that you have to pay a lot of money online for a Word document that's been repeated many, many times. And you should, if you have a handbook and with your policies, you should review them once a year in line with changes that come up. And just in changes with your business, if you've already got people in your business and you employ a lot more and your organization grows, you'll find that some of those policies need to be reviewed. So we're now going to move on to an employment update for this year, 2026. A lot of changes have come out in the last 2 years. So this covers off some of those changes and gives us a bit of an insight into what's coming up down the line, because the changes haven't stopped. We had the Employment Rights Bill, which went through Parliament about 18 months ago. Parts of it got signed off, which have become the Employment Rights Act, and there are parts of it that are still to come. So we're going to cover off those now. So the Employment Rights Act of 2025, these are the bits that were signed off and that have come through as changes. I'm doing a lot of work with organisations at the moment just to make sure they're in a really good place with all of these changes. And some people have an audit with me where we literally go through everything, and we have to start again because perhaps they didn't have anything in place or it was very old. and it needs a real revamp. And some people book in just a review, just to make sure they're in a really good place, and then they just carry on. And it's really helpful to review your documents, to review where you are and your policies, and just make sure that you're doing everything correctly. So one of the major changes that has come out is the introduction of the Fair Work Agency. And this is a group of people, there's 150 of them around the country, and they are an agency that can go into businesses and visit and audit. And they are looking to make sure that people are complying with the minimum wage, which changed again in April. They're looking to make sure people are complying with holiday management and how that is being processed in your business. And are you offering the right amount of holiday? Are you paying holiday properly? And if you've got people on, for example, 0 hour contracts, are you paying their holiday properly? Are you also, when people are leaving the business, are you making sure that you pay them up any holiday owed? And are you making sure that you've got a policy in place where it's fair for everybody? So sometimes we find in businesses, some people end up with more holiday than other people, and that's fundamentally unfair. So it's all about having a process in place. So currently, the Fair Work Agency are focusing on employment agencies and on cases of modern slavery. So we don't think that the normal organisation would get a visit for perhaps another year, that the visits would start on SMEs. So now is a really good time to get your ducks in a row. Preventing sexual harassment in the workplace is something that came out in October 2024, and it has just been revamped. So the revamp that they brought out in April states that employers now need to show they've taken all reasonable steps to ensure that sexual harassment in the workplace is not happening. And by all reasonable steps, they mean there's training in place, there should be a policy in place. It doesn't have to be separate. It could be, for example, part of your equality, diversity, and inclusion policy, and there should be a risk assessment, and that risk assessment should be a live document. So if there is an incident or if training's taken place, you should be updating that risk assessment. The law has also stated that if you can't prove that you've taken reasonable steps or all reasonable steps, if there is a tribunal and you're found not to have done what you should have done, the tribunal can uplift your award by 25%, which is a huge amount of money. If, for example, somebody is awarded £15,000 in a sexual harassment claim, then on top of that, you can get an extra 25% uplift on what you owe that person. So it's a big financial penalty. One of the other changes is flexible working. So that came out last year, and that's the right to flexible working from day one. And also paternity leave is a right from day one now as well, which is in terms of the UK compared with the rest of Europe, we're really, really behind on paternity and maternity policies and law. So it's really good to see that our government is focusing now on paternal and maternal rights. Statutory sick pay, that used to be payable from day 4, and now it's payable from day 1. And also there's no lower earnings limit. So it used to be that you had to earn a certain amount to be eligible for SSP, but now it is day 1 with no limit. And then the government have also brought out a neonatal care policy, Leave and Pay Act, which means that if you have a child who needs neonatal care, you can have paid leave and paid time off to care for that child if needed. So things that are coming down the line, there's some big ones coming down the line, and a really big one is the unfair dismissal claim period will change from 2 years to 6 months. Now, this means at the moment, if you employ somebody and from day 1 up until 2 years, you can dismiss somebody from your business as long as you're not discriminating against them. And you can dismiss them for reasons such as things are just not working between us, or I just don't think you're the right person for the job. Or it might be that a couple of incidents has happened and you put those all together in one pot and just say, look, we've had a few challenges, we've had a few issues, you've got less than 2 years service, we're ending your contract. And you can do that legally with less than 2 years service. And what the law is going to change to now is you've only got a 6-month window. And that law is going to change in October, but it means that people from July this year will be eligible for that. So if I start my new job on the 1st of July, I'm going to fall into that law change in October 2026. So employers need to start thinking now about how they're going to manage that, especially businesses that use the unfair dismissal claim period to manage people out of their business within 2 years. And it is it is abused, and that's why the government are changing it, because some employers use it as a way to just get rid of people before the 2-year period. And what the government has done here is they've made it harder to do that. So that's something that pretty much all organisations are going to have a think about. And one thing that they should think about is their probationary periods. You should have a probationary period that is shorter than 6 months so that you can manage the probationary period properly and you can exit somebody that needs to be exited before that 6-month period is up. That's what I would advise people to do. So perhaps, for example, a 4-month probationary period, which then gives you a month if you need to extend probation, and then you still have a month to say goodbye to somebody if they're not the right fit for your business. We've then got the code of practice on dismissal and re-engagement. That sounds very serious. And what that is fire and rehire. Some of you will remember the famous P&O fire and rehire from a couple of years ago, where P&O fired a lot of people from their business and then rehired them on different terms and conditions the following day. And they basically rehired them on less favourable conditions. And what the government have now said is that needs to stop. So you can still fire and rehire, but if you're going to rehire them, the conditions and the terms need to either be the same or better. So fire and rehire can still happen, but you need to be very careful about what you're offering when you bring people back into the business. Just like the preventing sexual harassment work, we're also going to be looking at equality and race and disability coming down the line. So there'll be a lot of work around equal pay for people, how we manage disabled people in the workplace. And they're going to look at harassment in general, how are we dealing with harassment, whether it's racial harassment or discrimination of any kind. They've started with sexual harassment, but they intend to look at bullying as well, bullying and respect. And all that will start coming down the line from October. Large organisations will have to report on ethnicity and disability pay. They're going to look at apprenticeships and have a reform of that. We've talked about the exploitative 0 hours contracts, which is under review and changes are coming. And they're going to also extend the time that you can take someone to a tribunal. So at the moment, you've got 12 weeks, and that's going to be extended. So what that means for an organisation is that if, for example, I leave tomorrow, I'll have a longer period of time before I have to actually take my case to a tribunal. I'm not sure yet how much they've agreed they're going to extend by, but at the moment, 12 weeks. Let's say they make it 6 months. So if I leave today, in November, you could get a letter from me saying, or an email from me saying, I'm taking you to tribunal. And at the moment, it's taking between 18 months and 2 years to actually get to a tribunal. So you might see me in court in November 2028, which is crazy. So one of the things I work very hard with my clients when they're in that situation is the ACAS conciliation service, where we try and settle before we even get to that point, because those timelines are they're really difficult to work with. So they are some of the changes that are coming up. Now, the last section of this training is around other employment considerations to think about that are beyond the employment contract and the policies that you have. So what else should you consider if you are looking to employ somebody? So you should definitely get hold of employer's liability insurance, which covers the cost of legal fees and damages. For example, if an employee falls at work or is injured in your workplace, you would then be covered. You need to think about your payroll processes. So if you're bringing somebody on board, you need to have payroll in place. You need to have a means to email them a pay slip. You need to be able to process their holiday. You need to be able to process sick pay. You need to be able to accurately pay them. So I would always advise talking to either a payroll person, there are payroll companies I can put you in touch with, or perhaps talk to your accountant who probably runs a payroll service. But I would always advise having somebody do your payroll for you. It's very helpful from an audit point of view to have a different person doing payroll than you, who is the business owner. You also need to think about the right to work in the UK. So it's a legal requirement that you check everybody's right to work in the UK on their first day. So before they start working with you, on day one, you should see a physical copy of their passport or their birth certificate or their visa, their working visa. Whatever their right to work in the UK is, you need to see a physical copy of it. and then you take a photocopy or a copy of that and you save that in their HR file and you give them back their original. You have to have that for everybody that is employed to work with you. I hear business owners say to me all the time, well, they're British, they were born in Stevenage. Okay, but you still need to do it. You need to think about the safe storage of documentation and GDPR. So if you are holding employee records, you're holding their right to work for a start. You'll also have their payroll information. I'd recommend that you ask people for a next of kin if there's an emergency. If you need to phone somebody and say, someone's had a fall at work, or I've had to call an ambulance, or they haven't turned up today, I hope they're okay, you need to know who to call. And all of that is governed by GDPR and compliance laws. You've got to make sure you're paying the minimum wage. And for the last 5 years in a row, we've had an increase in minimum wage every year, every April. So you have to keep on top of that. And consider the living wage as well, if possible. Pensions are a legal requirement. So after 3 months, any employees are entitled to be signed up for a pension scheme. And it's your job as the employer to make sure that happens. Again, your payroll person will help you with that, or your accountant, but you must do that, and it's a legal requirement. References is always a point of contention. Some people ask for references, some people don't. But think about when and how you're going to ask for references and be consistent. So if you're employing somebody and you decide that you want 3 references and the job offer is conditional on those references coming through and them being good, then that's absolutely fine. But if you go and employ your second employee and you think, oh, it's all right, she looks okay, I won't bother with references, then that's not really fair on that first person. And so you can't keep changing the way that you do things when you employ somebody. You've got to have consistency so that you don't have people saying that you're being unfair. And then think about whether you need an HR admin person or an HR system. So I'm an HR partner for Breathe, which is a very simple HR admin system where you can put all of your employee data, holiday management, it calculates sick pay. It does all sorts of things. It's a very simple system, and I can go in as an administrator and support, or I can train up the HR person in your business to manage Breathe. So that's just one example of many HR tools out there. So this slide is a summary really of all the support and information. I've talked about a lot of this as we've gone through the training today. The ACAS guidelines are fantastic. The ACAS website is brilliant. I would encourage every employer to have a shortcut link to ACAS. You can ask questions on the website. You can look at all the policies. It's really good just to check any information. They keep it completely up to date, and it's a brilliant source for any questions that you've got. You can also download documents as well. So if you want a policy, you might be able to find a policy on there that you can then adapt for your business. The CIPD website is also really, really good for guidance on HR and the changes, especially in recent years, the changes that are coming up. You've got health and safety info on the HSE website, which is where I go to if I have a health and safety question or if I need a risk assessment. My first point of call is always HSE. Gov.uk has got lots of statutory information. And for example, I use gov.uk regularly for holiday calculations. So if someone's joining an organisation or is leaving and I need to calculate how much holiday they're owed or what their holiday entitlement is, there's a calculator on gov.uk which just does it all for you, and it's wonderful. The same with redundancy. You can put in people's details for redundancy and it will come up and tell you the statutory redundancy pay that they're owed. So some really fantastic tools out there. Much better than you trying to work it out manually and risk getting it wrong. What you can do with those calculators as well is take a screenshot, which is what I do, especially with the redundancy, because I can screenshot the information, send it to my client and say, this is what the calculator says. We've also got AI, which is contentious sometimes, but you can use AI in many different ways. For example, if you want to write a policy on well-being, you could ask AI to get you started. So you could say, ChatGPT, for example, I'm a small business, I've got 5 employees, they're a mixture of male and female, they're this age, this age, this age. You could talk about the industry that you're in, the sort of company that you are. And then you could say, look, I want a policy, a well-being policy, give me some suggestions or start me off. And AI will give you a really good start. What I would then recommend you do is download that and start putting the human touch into it and start making it individual for your business. So, what I don't think you should do is download it and then keep that as your policy. I think you should adapt it and add in a human element for your organization. And then we've got HR systems. So, we've talked about Breathe, and there are a number of HR systems out there where you can compare and contrast what they do. And I'm very happy to have conversations with anyone around what would be good for their business and what they need. And then, of course, there's HR partners like myself who give guidance, advice, and can do HR work for your business. And just to finish off, then, how can I help you? So, I'm very happy to have no obligation chats about your organisation and what you need. I do an HR audit on people processes. It takes about 2 hours, costs £150, and I then build a plan which you can decide whether you want to go ahead with or not. And the plan is based on what I found out at the audit and my recommendations. I also have bundles, so I've got contracts, policies, I've got all sorts of information that you might need for your business. I offer either ad hoc services or retained HR services, and advice and guidance on an hourly rate if that's needed. And I can be found on LinkedIn or my website. And my phone number and website are there in the corner. And finally, I'd just like to say thank you all very much for listening. And I hope that's been helpful. And please do get in touch if you have any questions around getting your HR ducks in a row.